So we're going to have a discussion about the philosopher Socrates. To put specifically, we're going to talk about some of his statements that he made. From my perspective, I believe that Socrates mentored Plato, and one of the concepts that really stood out to me with regards to Socrates was the whole premise of Socratic questioning. And Socratic questioning is a great way of establishing truth. So the first quote, and we're going to try and unravel this, is, quote, "Let him that move the world first move himself," end of quote. Now, me personally, I think this is a really good quote, because it talks about, it feels a bit self-helpish, to be honest, but it addresses this whole concept of be the change before you try to change the world. And I think there's some validity in that. I guess the counter argument is, can you change the world without first changing yourself? Does it have to be in that linear process? What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean that's an idea that permeates almost everything we do, I think. So, and in explicit form, and more implicitly, and in forms that we're so used to now that we don't even think about them. Arguably, education in schools is such a form of dealing with the internals of your personality, your knowledge, your skills, your capability, to prepare you to face difficult situations, so that you've got the what that also imports is the learning that you will have derived from predecessors and other people. So absolutely, the developing of the internal side is extremely important. If you look at, as you mentioned, self-help, but a little more than that, based on research and a lot of validation, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Successful People starts with 3 habits that are all internally focused. These are habits that revolve around such things as setting goals, getting everything in the right order and developing priorities and so on. And I think it is true. You need to have that internal structure before you've got a hope of changing the world. If you haven't, what are you going to change the world to? How can you have a view even on how you will make such changes, let alone bring them into effect?
So, playing devil's advocate, is there a counter argument here that you could move the world without moving yourself first? Or is that, do you think, completely irrational? So, to think of an example, you could have a scientist that moves the world through his or her discoveries in science, but they may not, as an individual, they may not be an ethical person or things of that nature. Or am I taking it out of context here?
Yeah, the ethics of that person in that context are probably not a particularly determinative factor, maybe. So, for example, if we're talking about scientific truth and advancement, it stands alone from any individual and their views. The reason for that, though, is important to the question, because it's developed, or the scientific method is a discipline. It is something that somebody has to be trained in, and has to appreciate, and has to be able to demonstrate. And probably one of the worst sins you can ever commit, for example, as a scientific researcher, is to do something that would be called unethical or described as unethical in the context of that research. For example, making up results. Well, on the one hand, if you want to change the world, you could legitimately ask the question, why don't I publish scientific papers and I'll make up all my results because I want to achieve an influence in a certain way. But that, in the context of science, is profoundly wrong, and any such discovery of behaviours of that nature would lead to that person being permanently excommunicated from that community, and rightly so.
So this is a brief intermission. I sincerely hope you're enjoying the journey. And if you are enjoying the journey, please consider to like and subscribe. I repeat, consider to like and subscribe. And with that being said, let's get back to the program. And the next quote, one of my favorite quotes from Socrates, is, quote, "The poets are only interpreters of the gods," end of quote. Now, when I think about that statement, you think about great poets, Emily Dickinson, Shakespeare, William Wordsworth, Langston Hughes, just to name a few. Is it correct that these people are almost tapping in to like a higher power, and in a sense they are like a vessel for something that's bigger than them? I guess there's a few things too that could be discussed here. Is this simply Socrates just romanticizing the term? And also, what does he mean when he used the term gods?
Yeah, so the statement itself is a form of poetry, either given by the gods or given by Socrates' own wise mind. So I don't think that there is a lot of evidence that any poem has ever emerged from a god of any description. But what we do know is that human beings are phenomenally creative, and the human mind being literally the most complex system in the universe, which has very, very close and complex connections, is able to perform innovative tasks, not just calculations, not just memories, but tasks of innovation, whereby completely disparate ideas and thoughts can be brought into conjunction, and from it spawned a completely new idea. There's a complete parallel, I would say, between the evolution, the birth, the evolution, and the development of ideas in the intellectual world in the same way as there is in the biological world. And it's largely a similar process.
Now, it's a very interesting observation. I'm actually reading the statement again, and I've got a different interpretation here, because it says, quote, "The poets are only interpreters of the gods," end of quote. Now, when you take the term only, that could be seen as undermining poets, saying that you are only an interpreter of the god, meaning that you're getting your message from something else, and therefore you're not that creative. So I think that's another interpretation. It wasn't my initial interpretation, but that could be one interpretation. So in conclusion, we've looked at two quotes. We've looked at the, moving yourself before you move the world. And I think generally we both agree with that sentiment. Yes, I played devil's advocate and gave the example of the scientists that may not have moved themselves in an ethical way, but still may have created something that had moved the world. But again, that example, I think we both agree, is fairly faulty, and the logic of being the change or moving the world internally before you move it externally definitely sounds like good advice. And with the next bit about the poets being the interpreters of the gods, I think we both agree here that there's such a massive level of subjectivity to this line. What was the context? Was it romanticized? Is it a derogatory term in terms of they're only interpreters of the gods, therefore they're not that creative? Or is it something that is complementary? This assertion of having this connection to a higher power being a connection to the divine. And then you've pointed out some initial problems with the statement if it's taken too literally. So this is part 2 to Socrates' Philosophies, and basically we're just looking at various statements that Socrates has made and trying to dissect them. So this is a statement that I really like, which is, quote, "I was really too honest a man to be a politician and live," end of quote. Now, the reason I like this quote is because there is a current assertion, I would argue, that politicians are perceived as being untrustworthy. But not only is that assertion in the contemporary times, judging by that statement, it would seem that even in Socrates' times, maybe, or he felt that way. I'm not sure how the society would have felt towards politicians. And it's an interesting narrative that to be an honest man and to be a politician are polar opposites, when on paper politicians should be the most honest. And I just think that that's such an interesting insight that has stood the test of time. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there is something about politics which renders it untrustworthy in a strange way. So when you, I won't go all the way back to Socrates, I have no idea, but within the limits of my memory and experience, if you go back several decades, I think that generally politicians, at least the most high-profile politicians, would have been perceived as being honest but wrong, generally speaking, if you disagreed with them, and honest but right if you did. You know, if you go back to, say, an Edward Heath and a Harold Wilson, you can pinpoint differences, but these were differences which stood apart from the individuals. There were differences such as, should the United Kingdom be part of the European community as it was at the time, or not? Should we introduce VAT or not? Should we decentralise or not? Should we have a pay rise or not? So now, thanks to a lot of communication, media, thanks to leaks and a general decline in the, I wouldn't even call it respect, but the kind of regard that people, and the deification of politicians that existed at the time, that has largely gone. And what we see now is the real people behind the scenes. And what we do is we conflate policies and the individual's behaviours. So that's one aspect. Second aspect is that the nature of politics requires a huge diversity of views to be integrated into action, into policies. And those policies can never please everybody. And so at elections, for example, when you're trying to get the power in order to implement your policy, there may be a tendency to exaggerate, to be a little vague. So, yeah, I mean, politics is necessarily a little bit, as they say, economical with the truth. And we are in an era when we conflate the individual characters with the policies, which might be a mistake on our part as electors.
Do you think then that, is it a case that politicians are mendacious, they're untrustworthy, or is it a case that politicians are in a game that's untrustworthy? Because on one hand, there are so many politicians throughout the years. There's been hundreds, there's been thousands. One would assume that some, maybe the majority, would have been truthful and would have been honest and would believe what they're saying. So is it a case that we have maybe the game of politics promotes people that have, to put it politely, a different kind of relationship with the truth?
Very polite indeed, yeah. We're always very polite. But yeah, that's a great distinction, the game versus the individual aspirations.
So let's move on to the second quote. And this is, quote, "An education obtained with money is worse than no education at all," end of quote. So when I looked at this statement, I thought to myself, the premise here is that money distorts education. And then I'm thinking, is that premise true? And then I realized that education within Socrates' time may be different to the education in our contemporary times. So in theory, your money should not affect your education. In theory, I know a lot of people may disagree with that, because you could argue that if you have a lot of money, you have a lot more resources, and therefore might be able to hire private tutoring and things of that nature. So I'm assuming that maybe in his time, if you had a lot of money, then the education would be less effective than if you had no money. Maybe you were treated differently, and therefore you weren't really experiencing the education in its truest sense. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't really understand it, to be honest, because the education per se, as an education, not how you use it, for example, surely that has no relevance to whether you have money or don't.
So this is a brief intermission. I sincerely hope you're enjoying the journey. And if you are enjoying the journey, please consider to like and subscribe. I repeat, consider to like and subscribe. And with that being said, let's get back to the program.
And whether it was paid for with money or not. So I really don't understand where that statement's fundamentally going. What I would add to it, though, or just caveat it with, is that often money is looked on as some, quite rightly often this is the case, but looked on as a potential force and power for bad ends. But the reality is, I think, that money or its equivalent is one of the cornerstones of sustainable development. If any enterprise is consuming more than it produces, it is destined to die. And so the money part of it, if the education, for example, produces more of it, that's surely a good thing, in principle, provided then it is subsequently used in a good way. So I don't know what Socrates had in his mind when he said that, but I can't find a way to fit it into mine that makes a lot of sense.
Could it be a case of he was referring that if you actually just paid for the certificate, that when your formal education ends, that doesn't mean your education has ended?
Absolutely. So the certificate mill or the diploma mill that we seem to see today would be the equivalent, and clearly a diploma of that nature is no better than the kind of amusing version that you see in The Wizard of Oz, where the straw man has no brain, but he's given a certificate, and therefore he feels like he's achieved something. It's actually quite wrong. So if that's the meaning of it, absolutely, I agree with you 100%.
So I guess in conclusion, with regards to the first statement, we've got this interesting narrative that even in Socrates' time, to be honest, and a politician are not connected. And as we've explored, there's this interesting commentary or this interesting philosophy of are politicians bad, or is it the game that makes politicians bad? And clearly one would assume that there are some good people in politics, but is it the poison of the game that makes people bad? And then the other question could be, are politicians really bad, or is it the perception of us that's bad? Maybe those things are not linked. And with regards to the statement with regards to money and education, I think we're both confused about this statement. But I would say if he assumes that if the context is education is purchased with money without going through the process, then I, of course, would agree with that sentiment. But it's hard to establish if that's what is meant. I think education, assuming you've gone through the process and you're continuously learning, it would seem that whether there's money or not is irrelevant. What is relevant is the teaching effective, and are you taking that education in, and are you adapting that education not only in your professional life but in your personal life as well? So you were saying something really interesting about Socratic questioning. Now, to me, Socratic questioning, I think, is effective because it's about understanding the context. And I know I use the word context an awful lot, but it's almost like if someone says evolution is true, and then you go, can you explain why evolution is true? Then to a certain extent, that's using Socratic questioning to understand what that statement means. And I think when we use Socratic questioning, we get intimate with the philosophy. We get intimate not only with the outcome, but the process of understanding, if Socratic questioning is used effectively. But you had this counter narrative that I thought was particularly interesting. So could you share that with us again?
Well, I was just questioning the questioning method, because the Socratic method of analysis involves a very cooperative approach between someone asking questions and someone who is the person receiving the wisdom answering them. And I think there's a fundamental problem at the heart of it, which is that it's a cooperative system, and in the dialogue that is presumably written initially by a single person, almost like a play, the answers are the right answers, not challenging answers, but the right answers. In other words, and the questions are the right questions. So in other words, you set up a train of thought which is internally unchallenged in any way. And therefore, it's not surprising that once you've marked your own homework, you get the answer you were looking for. Now, I think this can be used for deception and self-deception. And it's the opposite of the type of questioning you would get, for example, in the methods of Karl Popper, in what is loosely and somewhat wrongly termed the scientific method, or in adversarial fora, such as in a parliament, or in a courtroom, where both sides or multiple sides of a question can be analysed. So I think it leads to very satisfying and self-contained results that have a sense of being predetermined and a very easy flow of conversation, very easy to follow, a bit like the frequently asked questions on the back of almost anything you buy these days, where you're given the answers to questions they like to answer. But the fundamental weakness is that it can lose the opportunity to challenge and to find real truth and find the weaknesses in arguments.
So in a sense, what you're saying is that Socratic questioning can be deployed in such a way where there's an irony, where we actually get further from the truth as opposed to getting to the truth.
Absolutely, and for example, the idea of the false dichotomy could be at the heart of that type of questioning.
Yeah, I think from what you're saying, it's almost like, and maybe this is not the right term, but it's almost like the spirit in the way someone's using Socratic questioning is important. I would argue that Socratic questioning is something that's important for our intellectual development, whether we use it or not. So, for example, if someone says to you, I don't know, Floyd Mayweather is the greatest boxer of all time, and then you say, why are you saying that? It encourages a dialogue, but more importantly, it encourages that person to give reasons. And therefore, okay, you're saying the outcome that this person is the greatest boxer of all time, but why? Why are they the greatest boxer of all time? So let's try to further get into the Socrates brain. And when we think about the Socrates brain, there is a prevailing concept here, and that Socrates was against democracy. So Socrates was against democracy. So in one sense, democracy was the enemy. So if we use a car analogy, the car of democracy is not the most efficient. Now there's a few important things to consider here. And this is that according to Socrates, only the educated should be given the ability of this power. And this ability is the power of voting. Now let's add some additional premises to this. So we got, for me, this is just my opinion, we have good democracy, we have bad democracy, we have democracy in Socrates' time, and then we have the concept that democracy was a conflict of interest to his endeavors being Socrates' endeavors. Now let's think about this. Let's think about the conflict of interest. So if we got Jack's got a restaurant and John's got a restaurant, it's going to be a conflict of interest to say, for John to say that Jack's restaurant is better than his. So conflict of interest is always an important thing to consider when we're making assertions. So to my understanding, within Socrates' time, democracy was a conflict of interest to what he was doing. So when you have a conflict of interest, it's almost impossible for someone to align with the opposition. So that's something to consider. Another thing to consider is this concept of you have to be educated to vote, which leads to a question. What is educated? If the educated vote is what we need, then we need to define what educated is. Is it formal? Is it informal? Is being educated some type of test? Or maybe it's a process, like we see in university. Someone does typically a 3-year course and then they get a degree. But this is a very important thing to define. What is educated? And then another important element here is to understand what is democracy. And in a simple sense, democracy is, quote, government by the people, majority rule, end of quote. Let's give an example. So the Conservatives are in government because they have the majority vote. That is a classic example of democracy. Now let's go back to one of my earlier premises, and that's bad democracy. So bad democracy to me would be a false implementation of real democracy. In thinking about this, I've had some considerations. The first one is a question really, and that is, if voting is a skill and the majority don't have this skill, is democracy the best way forward? However, surely a government by the majority is the best way of fair rule. So here's another question. If Socrates hated democracy in his time, would he hate it in his contemporary times? And it may be impossible to answer that question. So we're still talking about the philosopher Socrates, and we're going to understand the statement, quote, the life which is unexamined is not worth living, end of quote. And to understand this statement, you need to understand the 4 premises. And here's a question. What are the 4 premises? It's a good question. And I'm going to explain this. But let's first contemplate a huge irony, because the philosopher Socrates is considered in the Western context one of the founders. But despite this, Socrates had no school or no writings to his name. This perhaps was not unsurprising because of the time period. And Plato, the philosopher Plato, documented Socrates' ideas. So here's another question. Would we know who Socrates was if Plato did not play the role of documentation? Here's a metaphor. Socrates built the car, Plato drove it, and we witnessed the journey. This has led to some people questioning the historical Socrates, and the Socratic problem is that we don't know Socrates because our interpretations are based on perceptions from other people. But let's get back to the question and explore the 4 premises of the quote, the life which is unexamined is not worth living, end of quote. So to live a good life, there's 2 premises. The first premise is you need to understand what is good, and then the second premise is that you need to understand what is evil. So there's 2 clear distinctions there. And then the third premise is the following. You need to understand that knowledge and morality have a relationship. And this leads to the fourth premise, and that is ignorance has a connection with a lack of morality. And when you combine these four premises together, this leads to the quote, "The life which is unexamined is not worth living." End of quote. To put another way, there is one good, which is knowledge, and there is one evil, which is ignorance. So, in the Socratic perspective, the unconscious incompetence becomes evil. So here's two questions. If we all know nothing, does that mean we are all evil? Or if we know that we know nothing, does that mean we are all good? These are interesting philosophical questions to ponder.